In today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know regarding the setInterval function within JavaScript. I'm first going to go over just a high-level overview of how setInterval works. Then I'm going to get into some examples of exactly how it works and go into some more details here to make sure that you have a solid understanding of it. So first off, setInterval, it is a global function within JavaScript that will call a function at some specified interval, and it will continue to call this function at this specified interval until you call the clearInterval method or until the web browser is closed. Okay, so let's actually take a look at what this looks like. So here on line 18, you can see me calling the setInterval method, and you can see that I'm not calling this method on any object or anything like that. I am just calling this method right away within my JavaScript program, and this is because it is a global method within JavaScript, and JavaScript gives us this method for free. It actually exists on the window object, but I don't need to do something like this. JavaScript will already implicitly know when I call setInterval that I'm calling it on the overall window object. So you can just call this within your programs for free. Now, when I call this method, it takes two required arguments. One is going to be a function, and that is going to be the first argument that you pass to setInterval. And then the second is going to be a time. And that time is going to be the amount of milliseconds that you want to elapse between your intervals before you call your function again. So here, what I'm telling JavaScript to do is, okay, I want you to set an interval in which you call this function right here, labeled myCallback, every 500 milliseconds. So then JavaScript will then go and call this function at an interval of every 500 milliseconds, or half of a second. And then you can see on line 20, I define a function called myCallback. That's the function I passed to setInterval. And then I just console.log running interval. So if I run this here, you're going to see that in my console, I'm just continuously console logging running interval because the setInterval function is going to call this function every 500 milliseconds. Now I'm going to just kill my program there with Control-C and then clear that console to make things a little bit more clear. And as you can see, the setInterval function, it just will continuously run that function at that interval, which this is something to really keep in mind. This can really potentially hurt the performance of your applications if you're setting intervals all the time and not remembering to clear them. So when you do set an interval within your application, make sure that you also have some logic that makes sure to clear that interval once it's been set. And that brings me right to my next topic, and that is clearing intervals. So this is a basic example on how to set up an interval. But what if we want to clear the interval within your application? Well, you also have a method that exists globally within JavaScript called clearInterval. And it's just the same way as setInterval as it relates to it being global, meaning you can just call the clearInterval function. It exists on the window object, but JavaScript implicitly already knows that you're calling this method on the window object, so you don't need to do something like window.clearInterval. You can just call clearInterval straight away. And the way that this works here is that the setInterval method, when you call it, it actually will return some number, and this will act as an ID for setInterval. And then to clear this interval, what you do is you will then pass the ID of the interval that you set or the interval that you want to clear to the clearInterval method, and that will clear your interval. So here in my example here, I am assigning a constant called interval ID to the return value of setInterval. And I'm just going to call my callback here after every 500 milliseconds. And I'm just going to console.log running interval like I do before. Now here on line 33, I'm actually going to set a timeout. And if you haven't seen my video on set timeout, that was my previous video, but I'm going to set a timeout in which I'm going to call the clearInterval method, and then I'm going to pass my interval ID. So the clearInterval method, it takes an ID of whatever interval you want to clear. And I'm going to clear this interval after 2000 milliseconds. So what you're going to see here is I'm going to first run this callback a few times before this timeout expires, and then I clear my interval. So if I run this function here, you're going to see that I'm running my interval a few times, but then it stops because I'm making sure to clear my interval after 2 seconds there. So you can use the clearInterval method to clear the intervals you set, or else they're just going to keep running until someone closes their web browser, which can create kind of memory leaks and performance issues that you probably don't want. Now, the setInterval method here, it can also take a couple more arguments, and you can set up different parameters for your kind of setInterval method. So the way that this works is that, say you have your function here that you're passing into setInterval, but you want to pass arguments into your function. Well, I can't do something like open up my pair of parentheses and add my parameters here, because this is immediately going to call my function here. And I don't want to do that with setInterval. I just want to pass a function reference and let setInterval call it at some interval. So to pass arguments to the function that you pass to setInterval, you can actually pass those as arguments to the setInterval method following your milliseconds arguments. So starting at your argument number 3, you can start passing different arguments to the function of setInterval. So here, my third argument to setInterval is the string parameter 1, and my fourth is the string parameter 2, and I could have more arguments here just separated by commas. And then here, my callback function, you see that I'm expecting arguments A and B, and I'm just console logging those out. So what's going to happen here is setInterval, since I'm passing these arguments to it here, it's just automatically going to know, hey, what they're trying to do here is pass these arguments in to this callback function. So A is going to get assigned to parameter 1, and then B is going to get assigned to parameter 2. And then I also make sure to clear my interval after 2 seconds here. So if I run this here, you're going to see that I console log my 2 different parameters here a few times until I clear my interval. So if you want to pass arguments to your callback of setInterval, you can pass them just like this. Now, potentially an even easier way to do this would be, instead of passing those arguments there, you could just pass an inline function here to setInterval, and then since you're just passing an inline function reference, you can then call your callback with your parameters. So I'm going to just label this A and label this B here. So now I'm passing an inline function reference here, just an anonymous inline arrow function, and I'm passing this reference to setInterval. So setInterval, when it calls my anonymous inline function here, that function is then going to call my callback with my passed in parameters here. So if I run this here, you're going to see that I do get the values of AB, AB, AB until I clear my interval. All right, so those are 2 different ways that you can pass arguments to your callback function there. And that basically covers everything you need to know regarding the setInterval function within JavaScript. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in that next one.